Colleagues, we're resuming debate on motion 17. Last evening, we had to interrupt Senator Arnott, so we will continue with Senator Arnott now for the balance of his time. Senator Arnott.
Thank you, Your Honor. Well, I'm back, but I'm still in Treaty 6 territory at Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and the homeland of the Métis. Just a reminder, I'm speaking in favor of the motion, and I'll speak to the rule of law, Canada's democratic institutions, and my hope for the role of education in maintaining our democracy. So as you've noticed, I started my remarks last night. Therefore, I was able to have some sober second thought about what I'm going to say this morning, but you can be the ultimate judge of that. So Canadians have the right to protest, but there's a reasonable limit to that right in a free and democratic society. There is no protected right to lay siege to and unlawfully occupy portions of the parliamentary precinct and the downtown core of the city of Ottawa. Criminal activity, harassment, assaults, and intimidation of people in the occupied areas is not consistent with peaceful political protest. If there was remaining doubt as to whether this protest was peaceful, the balance was tipped when organizers implemented their plan to stay for the long term with seditious intent. The occupation was premeditated and funded by millions of dollars donated, a portion from foreign sources. This was an extraordinary action and not protected ordinary political protest. The organizers' stated goal was to force the end to the COVID-19 vaccine mandates, and they threatened to, in their occupation, to have the government of Canada comply with those demands. The more unhinged demand required the Governor General and this body to depose the recently elected government of Canada and to create a non-elected government made up of people the occupiers would select. During the occupation, protesters became entrenched, encamped, and embedded. They ignored the rights of the citizens of Ottawa to have peaceful enjoyment of their homes and their businesses. Equally concerning were the blockades of the Canada-US border at critical entry points throughout the country, in concert and in sympathy with the occupiers. The unlawful occupation and border blockades are without precedent in Canada. This extraordinary situation required an extraordinary response. I have heard from colleague senators in the debate question why the passage of this act is still necessary since the convoy has been dispersed from Ottawa. I hear your concerns about overreach and the relevance of the measures at this time. I can say as a former senior Crown prosecutor and a judge, an operation of this magnitude involving so many different units and levels of government does just not stop on a dime. And much of the work continues to identify perpetrators of criminal activity, foreign and domestic. As we've seen, the mayor of Winnipeg and the police force there are dealing with a blockade of trucks at the Manitoba legislature. It's not clear to me that potentially seditious acts and subversive activities from fringe elements have simply stopped because the blockade in Ottawa was dismantled. The police officers closest to this operation are advising that there is an operational need to continue their work. But note, they are not celebrating any victory. They are not declaring that the risk is abated. The threat assessment is continuous. The police service has a heavy responsibility. One protest leader leaving the Coventry Road staging area declared that this isn't over. We're switching to guerrilla tactics, or words to that effect. I have confidence in the professionalism of police services. The members of the cabinet, the civil service, and the other place were persuaded of the need to pass this legislation and deserve the benefit of the doubt, even for allowing for the exercise of unprecedented powers. This will be assessed in the inquiry, which was a wise idea in the act created by the Mulroney government. I would urge erring on the side of caution and common sense. Based on the information available to the Senate, I believe the threshold for implementation of the Emergencies Act has been met. The Government of Canada must restore public confidence to demonstrate that the state has the ability to ensure safety and security of Canadian citizens. The state must uphold the rule of law. The rule of law cannot exist if laws are not enforced, or if there are no consequences for those who choose not to obey the laws. This shocking and unlawful siege has exposed weaknesses and vulnerabilities that need to be prioritized for remedy by parliamentarians. Canada's reputation as one of the world's strongest democracies has been weakened. Internationally, Canada's economy has been damaged. Canadians expect their government to maintain the security, protection, and function of their democratic institutions. Change is happening at an unprecedented pace. It is happening technologically, culturally, socially, and politically. Complexity is leading to uncertainty. Uncertainty has led to fear, anxiety, and anger. Some Canadian citizens feel disenfranchised. Some Western democracies are dealing with this uncertainty because it's given rise to populism, racism, and hate. Canada is not immune. Some citizens feel disconnected. We have seen a promotion of anti-intellectualism, alienation, and polarization. Some citizens are losing faith in democratic institutions. Some citizens view these institutions with suspicion. Some do not have sufficient understanding of the roles of these institutions. I'm thinking here of journalists, the judiciary, and the Senate. Those roles are to provide checks and balances to hold government to account. Some citizens do not fully understand the responsibilities that accompany Canadian citizenship. Some citizens are disengaged. Sinister people promote and encourage a view of these institutions that is intended to prey upon the misfortunes experienced by marginalized and very vulnerable people. Their purpose is to instill or incite others to a malevolent view and ultimately to weaken our democracy. Some citizens accept half-truths and simple answers to complex questions. This has been generated and manipulated on social media by nefarious forces, both inside and outside of Canada. Democracy is fragile. Some Canadians take our democracy, our human rights, and our freedoms for granted. That is perilous. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance. One cannot be vigilant unless one has knowledge. Education generates knowledge. Education is the engine of democracy. Democracy is strengthened by education, knowledge, and understanding, and in turn, to a commitment to Canadian democratic institutions and peace, order, and good government. I've heard several protesters assert what they were doing was in the name of freedom. How ironic. Protesters asserted their First Amendment right and insisted on their Miranda rights when arrested near Parliament Hill, clearly not understanding that that is a reference to the United States Constitution. The protesters bandied about concepts and words that they do not understand. They spoke of freedom seemingly without understanding they have remedies before the courts or at the next election. What this protest lays bare is that we have fundamentally failed to educate our citizens about what it means to be a Canadian citizen. The 3 R's: rights, responsibility, and respect. I believe that is a critical lesson from this debacle. We need to proactively and purposely educate students about the rights of Canadian citizenship, and importantly, the responsibilities that accompany those rights. That is where we need to place our hope for the future. In stark contrast to the United States, which does not have a Section 1 clause, which is why our charter is so respected internationally, in Canada, the rights of citizens are balanced. The rights of citizens are never absolute. The rights of citizens are subject to reasonable limits. And most critically, the rights of citizens are directly linked to the responsibilities required in a free and democratic society. Every Canadian citizen has a responsibility to know and understand the rights of Canadian citizenship, so they do not knowingly transgress the rights of others. Every Canadian citizen has a responsibility to respect their fellow citizens. They may disagree with the political views of some, however, they must respect the right of everyone to hold their views. Canadian citizens are free to challenge any law, any edict, or any regulation. They must do so within the system that has evolved in the Western world since the Magna Carta. That is to say, if you feel your rights are infringed or denied, the remedy lies with the courts in our democratic system. I believe, considering the circumstances presented over the course of the last few weeks, the required response to the threat we are seeing in our democracy is to implement the use of the Emergencies Act. In my opinion, it is necessary at this time, it is fully justified, and it is constitutional. There are built-in safeguards. The declaration has a short duration. It will expire in 30 days, although it could be extended. It has joint parliamentary oversight. The Emergencies Act does not override the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I believe the federal government's response through the Emergencies Act is proportional to the threat on our Canadian democracy. Notably, the Act provides for an inquiry. The inquiry will provide the information needed to better inform any future use of the Emergencies Act and preventative measures to cure the grievances which precipitated these actions. We have to recognize the angst, the anger, and the fear many Canadian citizens have expressed. In the aftermath, we must learn, adapt, and act. We need to speak to all Canadians without finger pointing, no shaming, no blaming. Words have the power to maim. Canada needs to heal. The Canadian government is ultimately responsible for the invocation of the Emergencies Act and is accountable for its use. I support the motion to confirm the declaration of a public order emergency. Kenanashkom Tinawau Kakio. Thank you, everyone. Merci beaucoup.
On debate, Senator Marshall.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, honorable senators, for your comments and your speeches. We all know the history which led the government to this point, but it's not clear how we moved from a peaceful protest to the Emergency Act. The convoy started its journey around January 23rd. Media reported its progress daily, and we all knew it was headed for Parliament Hill. Each day, anyone could check to find out the location of the convoys. Media also reported on the smaller convoys headed to meet up with the larger convoy. We knew there were hundreds, if not thousands, of vehicles and protesters headed for Parliament Hill. Even the police were reporting on the convoy. Through the media, we were told the police were monitoring the incoming convoys, tubs, bouncy castles, and food concessions. Government allowed the protesters, along with their vehicles, to take possession of Parliament Hill, downtown Ottawa, and really almost all of Ottawa. Even the federal transport minister in media interviews restricted his comments to simply asking the protesters to go home. It took the initiative of one Ottawa resident to obtain an injunction to deal with the noise created. So the federal government, over a 3-week period, went from doing nothing to invoking the Emergency Act. And it hasn't been clearly explained what happened and why the act was invoked. If the government was aware that the convoy posed a credible threat before it came to Ottawa, and we were told that yesterday, why did the government wait 3 weeks before addressing the security threat? Why were the protesters allowed to set up on Parliament Hill? The lack of political leadership displayed over the past few weeks is absolutely unbelievable. One of the questions being asked is, did the government need to invoke the Emergency Act? Why didn't the police and the federal government do its job 3 or 4 weeks ago when they knew the situation was developing? Several senators are asking this question, and I know Senator Arnott asked the question when he began his speech this morning. Now that the blockades have been disassembled, why can't the police, CSIS, and the other authorities take over now, continue with the threat assessment, and revoke the Emergencies Act? Today, we even received notice that controlled explosives are stated to resume today or tomorrow in the renovation of the center block. So it sounds like the threat has been diminished. Several senators have also raised concern over the freezing of bank accounts. It is still unclear, and we talked about this in the Senate yesterday. Many senators raised, and it was also raised at the briefing with the ministers the day before. And it's still unclear as to who is affected, what process is followed to determine the blacklist, and what criteria has to be met in order to be excluded from the blacklist. It's also unclear as to how those individuals, organizations, and companies whose accounts have been frozen can have their bank accounts unfrozen, especially since they no longer have access to monies for lawyers and other advice. Despite this matter being raised by a number of senators, we have yet to receive sufficient explanatory information. The process of the freezing of bank accounts is an invisible, punitive process. Last evening, I saw in the media there was a report that some bank accounts are being unfrozen. Well, it was an ill thought out idea to begin with, but we are now seeking answers on this new development. Some senators have raised questions and concerns about the Parliamentary Review Committee. There is a concern that serious oversight cannot be carried out by the committee if it cannot receive all relevant information, including intelligence information. Honorable Senators, my expectations of this review committee, if it is ever established, is very low. It is not even established, and we are already learning about the restrictions to be placed on the committee. In closing, I'd like to reference Senator Tanis's motion number 30. We have been discussing the Emergency Act, a complex piece of legislation with far-reaching implications. While a briefing was arranged for senators, and Senator Gold did respond yesterday to many, many questions, senators are still being requested to approve or not without adequate study of the implications of a very complex Emergency Act. Honorable Senators, I would like to conclude by saying that in light of all the concerns that have been raised, I'm not convinced that the government had a plan. And now that they've implemented the Emergency Act, I'm still not convinced that they have a plan. I will be voting against the motion.
On debate, Senator Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Honorable Senators, I rise today to join in this historic debate. When I last spoke in this chamber, I lamented the role we are being relegated to. I called us the chamber of the rubber stamp. Today, however, we hold a very serious responsibility. A nay vote in this chamber would immediately revoke the emergency orders initiated under the Emergencies Act. We hold a unique veto power in this instance. The question before us right now is, should we use it? Like many, if not all of you, my office has been inundated with phone calls, and my inbox has been flooded with emails urging me to vote against the continued use of these extraordinary powers. On the other hand, law enforcement, ministers of the Crown, and various experts and pundits across the country urge the continued use of the emergency provisions, telling us that the emergency situation is ongoing and that we may lose control of the situation if the powers are revoked. I understand that Canadians are angry. There are those who are angry at vaccine mandates that they feel have infringed on their basic freedoms and negatively impacted their livelihoods. There are conversely those who are angry at what they viewed as inaction on the part of their elected representatives at the local, provincial, and federal level to quell this unrest in Ottawa and across the country until February 14, when the Emergencies Act was invoked. When all this is over, we must find out how we got to such a sad situation for our country. And I have lots of questions about how we got there. Why didn't the City of Ottawa police prepare for a convoy we knew was driving across the country? We all knew that. Why didn't the City of Ottawa invoke a court order? Why was the Prime Minister absent? Why didn't we hear a word, not a peep, from the head of the RCMP? The convoy and COVID have divided Canadians, neighbor from neighbor, family member from family member. Even I had a very public falling out with my political family in the parliamentary caucuses over this. So it is no surprise to me that the debate thus far has been spirited and at times emotional. Many have lamented that we have found ourselves at this point. Canadians have always prided ourselves on our public order and good governance. We have peace, order, and good government in our Constitution. And yet here we are invoking, for the first time, an act that gives broad and far-reaching emergency powers to the government after a protest turned into what has been classified as an illegal occupation. While I'm looking forward to the inquiry that will shine a light on the many failures at all levels of government to contain this issue earlier, I'm also cognizant of the fact that we cannot move forward in this debate without some examination, some serious examination, with the fullest information that can be made available to parliamentarians of how these failures contributed to the current state of things. Bylaw officers and local police did nothing to enforce the laws and bylaws that exist. No one is supposed to park on Wellington Street, at the heart of our democracy in Canada, the Senate of Canada, the Prime Minister's office, the House of Commons, the Supreme Court. You cannot erect structures in public places. You cannot idle your vehicle or create a noise disturbance. And yet, all of the convoy did all of these illegal acts for 3 long, agonizing weeks. The Premier was visibly absent during this period of unrest. And all the while, the Prime Minister made antagonistic and further polarizing remarks about a group that was clearly already beyond frustrated and on edge, causing them to strengthen their resolve and further entrench themselves in Ottawa. This is not leadership. This does not befit a Prime Minister whose mandate should be to bring Canadians together. Citizens launched a court action to stop the honking and took it upon themselves to block convoy members looking to further incapacitate the city by slowly circling around schools and airports. I received calls from concerned parents of Nunavut students attending university in Ottawa who were afraid for the safety of their children. And colleagues, Ottawa is the home of the second largest population of Inuit in Canada, next to my own community of Iqaluit. So I speak as a representative of people living, working, going to school, obtaining health services in this city who are from Nunavut and who have been greatly stressed, inconvenienced, scared by what's gone on. I heard from Inuit living in the city and helping organizations like Tungasuving Inuit that they were no longer able to access services. And I heard from homeless Inuit who were no longer able to reach safe spaces that enable them to survive in the harsh coldness of January and February. I don't agree with those that suggest that there was a diplomatic way forward in all of this. The main organizers were demanding all mandates be removed, even those within the purview of provincial governments. Otherwise, they would continue to occupy the downtown core. Key leaders pointed to their, and I use this term lightly, memorandum of understanding that called on the Governor General and the Senate to overthrow the democratically elected government, then use their newfound power to end all mandates. And the Governor General's office was flooded with calls. "911 was flooded with calls in Ottawa. Clearly, these are unreasonable actions and unreasonable demands. And when a group threatens to continue illegal actions until such unreasonable demands are met, that group is no longer exercising their rights to expression, association, and peaceful assembly that we cherish in this country. The courts tell us that peaceful protest does not extend to any gatherings that seriously disrupt the peace, as in R versus Lecomte, nor does it extend to any actions that physically block or impede lawful activities, as defined in Guelph City versus Soltis. Strictly speaking, the question before us today is, was the government justified in its invocation of the Emergencies Act? Looking at the evidence, at least from what we know, and colleagues, as I've expressed in questions I asked the government leader in the Senate yesterday, I think there is a lot that we don't know, and that the review committee should be trusted to look into on the aspect of intelligence information. But looking at the evidence that is available, I think it was justified. I think that there was such failure on the parts of the municipal, provincial, and federal government, as well as with local law enforcement, in their handling of this situation, that it ballooned into such an untenable situation that the only way to coordinate a peaceable way out was through this act. I believe above all else in the rule of law and its equal and consistent application. No Canadian should be above our laws, and everyone should be subject to natural consequences of breaking those laws. But I cannot divorce from this question another question, and it's a very important one to me. Are we still in an emergency? Do we still require the broad powers afforded by the emergency orders in order to contain what elements of the convoy and its major proponents remains? And we do have a national police force. We do have anti-terrorists capacity. We do have CSIS, who should be doing the job of staying on top of this and have the tools to do so in existing laws. Do we still require the broad powers afforded by the emergency orders? The answer to that is I don't know. I know what I hear on the media, but I don't know what the government and law enforcement knows. Senator Gold has vociferously told this chamber that this is not a matter of the government saying, trust me. But at the same time, he also called on us to have some faith that the government is acting in the best interest of Canadians. As a parliamentarian and a policymaker, asked to justify and support the continued use of these expanded powers, I don't feel comfortable with that. I would feel more comfortable if I knew that voting yes at the end of this debate would result in a powerful oversight committee that had access to protected information. And this is an issue I'm very concerned about. That was informing decisions in real time. I would feel better knowing that there was a pan-partisan group of parliamentarians that were able to keep the government in check. These are the types of checks and balances we demand in a democracy. And I would like to pay tribute to former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and Solicitor General Perrin Beatty and his cabinet that put together this very thoughtful Emergencies Act with a strong role for parliamentarians, representatives of the people, in adjudicating on the rightness of this order and its need to continue, and setting up rigorous, I hope, review and inquiry processes so we can learn from this very sad experience and make sure it never happens again. Going forward, I cannot absolve the government, the federal government, of the blame they share in creating this situation. Not just the convoy, but the polarized society that we now find ourselves living in. Years of policy changes that threaten the livelihoods of provinces dependent on resource extraction have led to Western alienation, sparking the creation of such political movements as Wexit and the Maverick Party, of which Tamara Leach, a figurehead in the convoy, was a founding member. And let us note that the identified leaders of this ragtag group are from Western Canada, a region of our country where the primary resource industry has been demonized by our government. The politicizing of the pandemic, which happened shamefully in the last election at the hands of the Prime Minister, the demonizing of the vaccine hesitant has further split Canadians. I am triple vaccinated and grateful to be so, and have found that the public health measures in Nunavut have kept Nunavummiut safe. And I thank the federal government for the support that's been given to the territories to help us deal with the threat of the pandemic, exacerbated as it was by our severe housing crisis, overcrowded housing. I have even refused the exemption afforded to parliamentarians and quarantined with my wife for 2 weeks before re-entering the territory in an effort to do my part to keep COVID out. It was only in the relaxing of some of these measures
Senator
that we
Patterson?
saw COVID spread widely throughout
Senator Patterson.
the territory.
Senator Patterson.
Measures.
I'm,
I don't think we should alienate those who don't feel the same way. We should all be deeply disturbed.
Senator Patterson? He's not hearing me. Senator Patterson, I'm sorry, but colleagues, I think that Senator Patterson doesn't seem to be understanding that what is happening in the Senate chamber. Do we have a technical issue again? Senator Patterson,
We can
Sound is
hear.
gone.
Senator Patterson.
Sound is gone.
We've lost the sound, Mr. Speaker.
Colleagues, I'm sorry, we will pause. We have a technical issue again. Okay, colleagues, we'll suspend until this technical issue is resolved. Thank you. But our colleagues on Zoom cannot hear me.
Gone again.
You can yell louder than them kids.
Test those same measures. Quite frankly, the more I listen to this debate and the more I speak with colleagues, I'm torn with how to cast my vote. As I said, I agree there was an emergency. I'm not totally convinced there still remains an emergency that requires these special powers. And I'm very concerned we'll not have in place the proper checks and balances to ensure there's no misuse of these powers or to ensure that they are revoked the instant, as one minister put it during the briefing, quote, they became convenient rather than necessary. So I will continue to listen with great interest to what respected colleagues in this chamber have to say as we continue with this important and historic debate. But frankly, right now, I'm not sure we continue to need this drastic measure at this moment. Thank you. Tema.
Sénatrice Miville de...
Senator Miville Deschênes.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The decision of invoking the Emergencies Act is a rare decision, and it's highly symbolic. One can safely assume that it will go down in history. As a Quebecer, I can tell you that the evocation of this law and its predecessor, the War Measures Act, reminds me of the events of October 1970. I was 11 at the time, and I didn't understand everything that was going on. I was amazed to see army tanks in the streets and hearing that artists around us were being arrested. Gérald Godin and the singer Pauline Julien in particular. These events were among the factors that led me to study political science and to devote several papers, maybe too many, to the October crisis and the arbitrary arrests authorized by the War Measures Act. 50 years later, I'm a senator, and I am called upon to vote on the government of the motion to confirm the proclamation of the Emergencies Act in order to bring an end to the disruptions in Ottawa. Let me say from the outset that these two emergency acts are very different. When the debates on the issue began last week, it became clear to me that this is not going to be an easy decision. Whatever one side or the other may say, I do not believe that the situation was black or white. Nothing was obvious. On one hand, we certainly see elements that can justify a strong government intervention, including the obvious inability of the Ottawa Police Service to control the situation, the highly organized nature of the demonstration, which became an occupation of a section of the city of Ottawa, the funding and foreign support for the protesters, the blockage of critical infrastructure and the resulting economic damage, the reported threats and vandalism and insurgent nature of some of the messages we heard, the instrumentalization of some children, the social and economic costs that were accruing, including for many residents who had nothing to do with the conflict. They went through a nightmare. Also, the risk that too much impunity for illegal acts would gradually erode the rule of law in Canada. I also note that the Emergencies Act, in addition to being subject to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, contains several provisions that aim to prevent authoritarian abuse, including a mandatory inquest. But will they have all of the tools that are necessary to shed some light on the question? I'm not sure. If the motion is adopted by the Senate, the government will not have limitless discretion, power without limits, without discretion. The Emergencies Act is more measured in its response than the War Measures Act. That said, as early as last week, other evidence led me to question whether the government was unequivocally demonstrated that the disruptions in Ottawa were indeed a national emergency, being an urgent, temporary, and critical situation that seriously endangers the health and safety of Canadians, or that threatens the ability of the government of Canada to preserve the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Canada. I noted in particular that the barricades at the Ambassador Bridge and the blockades in Alberta and Manitoba were dismantled using the usual legal tools without the need to invoke Emergencies Act, that the disruptions did not result in any serious injury or significant property damage, that the many provinces have opposed themselves to invoking the Emergencies Act. Many experts and specialists have expressed doubts with regards to the need to invoke this act and about the inadequacy of the tools already available to law enforcement. Comparing the events in Ottawa and other emergencies also tend to speak to the urgent, serious, and critical nature of last week's disruptions. Let's consider, for example, the 2012 student strike in Quebec, which led to several months of demonstrations, often held at night, resulting in violent clashes between demonstrators and police, and they caused much property damage. The 1990 Oka crisis, which resulted in a 77-day blockade and the death of 2 people. In both of these cases, the Emergency Measures Act was not invoked. I also thought about some recent protests abroad, including the major disruption caused by the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States, or by the Gilets jaunes in France, which lasted several months and led to injuries and resulted in much property damage. In none of these cases did governments invoke the equivalent of the Emergency Measures Act. I also noted that while the government's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act was defensible, the measures announced appeared quite broad in certain aspects and could set dangerous precedents. In particular, the prohibition of anyone simply participating in or traveling to a specific assembly, even if that person is not committing acts that are otherwise illegal. The broad authority to designate protected places, including some such as the Parliament Hill and other government buildings where citizens must be able to demonstrate peacefully. Also, broad prohibitions to contributions, financial or otherwise, that may be made to protesters by Canadian citizens.
Has also repeatedly mentioned the international dimension of the crisis. For the government, the disruptions in Ottawa and elsewhere damaged Canada's image as a stable and economically secure country. These are legitimate fears, but these are not the only ones that have been expressed abroad. The Economist magazine wrote last week that invoking the Emergencies Act was a terrible idea that could make Canada a more rancorous or bitterly divided country. For all these reasons, I was hesitant last week. There were arguments on both sides. I did not believe the government had made an unequivocal demonstration that Canada is going through a national crisis, that the tools ordinarily available to law enforcement were insufficient, and that we had reached the law of last resort. But I was also aware that my perception of the Emergency Measures Act is colored by my personal experience in the history of Quebec, and that in this case, this law was primarily aimed at a crisis in Ottawa. I thought that while the government didn't deserve a blank check, it could still get the benefit of the doubt, at least temporarily. But the reality is that the situation has changed considerably since last week. As the Globe and Mail wrote yesterday, the day before yesterday, the question before Parliament is not, was Canada facing an unprecedented national emergency a week ago? It is rather, is Canada facing an unprecedented national emergency today? Last week, there were arguments both for and against the Emergency Acts, but changed circumstances, the basic facts on the ground, have greatly strengthened the arguments against to the point where they are overwhelming.
The government itself repeats that it is assessing the situation every day and every hour. Our assessment of the motion must change as well based on the circumstances. Today, there is no longer a single blockade in Canada. There are a few trucks parked in Winnipeg. Ottawa has been cleared. More radical occupants have retreated. The extremist threat seems more diffused. There could still be doubts with regards to the utility of the Emergency Act to address the emergency last week. There's no doubt that a state of calm has now returned. We're no longer in a crisis. In response to questions, the government argues it must maintain the Emergency Measures Act as a preventive measure to manage a risk of further demonstrations. I don't think a government can invoke the Emergencies Act as a preventative measure. It's not a risk management tool. In all societies, including in Canada, there will always be risks. In my view, the government cannot justify the application of the Emergencies Act by referring to an undefined risk, a hypothetical threat, or potential disruption. In light of the overall situation across the country, the government's assertion that has secret information about potential threats is not sufficient to justify continuing emergency measures. This opens the door to obvious abuses. This law is highly valued by police services. I salute their efficiency, professionalism, and restraint. This law can be useful and effective, but the question before us today is whether it is still absolutely necessary. The government also mentions that the decision to invoke the Emergencies Act was well received by Canadians. I have no doubt about that. But that's not the question. The Senate has the privilege and the responsibility to consider and vote unfettered by electoral considerations. I also note that if the Senate were to vote against the government's motion this week, it would not have the effect of retroactively invalidating the decisions that have been taken or the actions that have been taken since the proclamation of the legislation. This effect seems to me to be consistent with the legitimate idea of giving the government the benefit of the doubt in terms of the situation over the past week. but I have not received a satisfactory answer to the key question that arises today. What is the threshold? What are the criteria that the government will use to decide whether to revoke the law? The true challenge we have here today is to maintain social cohesion in a society that is increasingly polarized. My colleagues, Kim Pate and Paula Simons, talked about it fantastically yesterday. In preparing a UNESCO conference in Quebec on the radicalization of young people that leads to violence, Quebec and Canada are not spared. Social media are amplifying all of this anger, and public health measures have become a rallying cry. It's very concerning. What is comforting in the short term is the context in the field has changed. Today, there's no ambiguity that could incite us to support the Emergencies Act. However, I will listen to my colleagues' arguments with care until the vote on Motion 17. Thank you.
Resuming debate, Senator Ousakos, followed by Senator Deacon, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Honourable colleagues, in my 13 years in the Senate of Canada, I don't think I have risen on a more important debate and issue than this one. I want to remind all senators in this chamber that our fundamental role when we were summoned to this place is to be the voice of our regions, to be the voice of minorities in this country. Voices that need to be heard, voices that need to be represented when they feel they're not being adequately represented, particularly in the other side, but also when they feel that they're being trampled on by the executive branch of government. There's no role more important in this place than the role of oversight of this institution on the government. And in this particular instance, we see a government where 1 minute these protesters, convoys were coming to Ottawa and they were marginalized by the Prime Minister. He called them a fringe minority. And the next minute, this fringe minority, the small group of Canadians that are anti-vaxxers and anti-mandates, all of a sudden became such a threat that we had to impose something that's been done in this country only 3 times before in the history of this country. So clearly, from that admission, the Prime Minister was wrong when he called this group a fringe group, a minority. Colleagues, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that it wasn't a fringe group. It isn't a fringe group. This country is deeply divided like I've never seen in my 50-plus years. I'm a proud Canadian. I've seen governments come and go. We've seen many crises in public discourse in the country, but never in my lifetime have I seen the deep divisions. And it's moments like this when the executive branch of government has an obligation, and every Prime Minister has an obligation to put the nation's interest above the interests of himself, his party, and partisan politics. I saw that many times under the leadership of Stephen Harper. I saw it firsthand in his caucus. I saw it under the leadership of former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, who I always appreciated. He put the nation first, regardless of political differences at various times, and God knows he had some very tough crossroads to manage in this country. I saw that under the leadership of Brian Mulroney as well. I know there's always a temptation on the part of politicians to wedge, to divide for political benefit, and I've seen firsthand that it works. But in these moments of an existential crisis, all Prime Ministers are obligated to bring the parties together, not to throw fuel on the fire, not to call protesters names, not to call them extreme right or extremists or racists or a few other words I won't even mention. We've had this debate and there's no point to revisit it. That kind of political posturing is completely unnecessary. And we saw this government do it in the last general election where they tried to create the atmosphere of them versus us. Somebody did some polls. So they realized, wow, 80% of Canadians are double vaxxed. So we'll make an example of 20% of Canadians that don't want to be vaxxed, or are vax hesitant, or have medical conditions, or have a phobia, or whatever the reasons may be. I believe in freedom, yes. I believe in freedom of a man and a woman to choose if they take a medical procedure. It's their choice in this country. Before you go for a surgery, they ask you to sign a form, a waiver. I don't think it's much to ask in this country as a Canadian citizen to have your governments lay off when it comes to taking vaccines or medications or medical procedures, or being forced to have or not have an abortion. It's the same type of debate for me as a libertarian. These are rights that should be fundamental in the country. So when these protesters come to Ottawa, there should be consistent rules for all Canadians. I'm double vaxxed. I try to persuade my friends, my neighbors, everybody. I believe it's genuinely the way to go in order to mitigate this disease and fight it to the best of our ability. But I also recognize the right of somebody else not to be vaxxed. I recognize the right of somebody to expect their government to be fair with all citizens, to be just with all citizens. So when protesters come to Ottawa, or they go to Coutts, or they go to Quebec City, or they go to Toronto, they have the right of protest. It's fundamental in our democracy, and nobody can take that away. But you know what? When protesters went to the G20 a few years back, they had the legitimate right to protest. When Indigenous communities had legitimate issues with the government, they went to the extreme with armed protests, shutting down infrastructure and railway crossings in this country for a number of weeks. When Black Lives Matter protests for issues that are important, they're fundamentally on the right side of where they should be on it. And every politician has the right to respect these protests. We have an obligation, particularly as parliamentarians, as a prime minister, whoever it is, to dialogue with these people. Somebody said earlier in their speech that the 3 R's are the most important thing in our democracy: rights, responsibilities, and respect. I think it was Senator Arnott, and I agree with him. It's a right to protest in this country. It's a responsibility, though, of Parliament and our Prime Minister and our governments to dialogue with these citizens. These are not enemies of the state. These are frustrated Canadians. If it's Black Lives Matter, if it's the Indigenous communities, if it's people at a G20 for economic reasons. We saw what happened in my province of Oka many years ago. I'm old enough to remember. And in all those instances, prime ministers threw water on the fire. They dialogued. They sent ministers in for discussions. They sent bureaucrats in to have chats with these people, trying to figure out what the problem was. They didn't say, you're undesirables, you're racists, you march with swastikas, you're tearing down monuments when when they didn't tear down monuments. We've had other protests in this country which desecrated monuments across the country, which burned down religious centers of worship. The Prime Minister didn't run out to invoke the Emergencies Act. He dialogued. So why in this instance did he choose to do otherwise? Is it because maybe he thought the poll numbers were on his side? Maybe he thought he'd get away once again of trying to create the us majority versus them, the minority? And then all of a sudden, he started realizing even us double-vaxxed people are frustrated in this country. We're frustrated with mandates that are not fair. For example, when a government institutes a travel mandate, they should institute a travel mandate. But no, there's a double standard with the policies of this government. So if you're a wealthy Canadian and you need to go see a family member in New Jersey or California, not a problem. Hop on a plane. You do your PCR test, you come back, you quarantine, life's a dream. If you have a sick mother in Vermont, for example, and you're in Montreal and you need to go visit your sick mom, you can't get over the border because of COVID, because of mandates. We got to do this. We got to save the country. But of course, if you sit back and think about it, so the sacrifices are going to be done for those who can't afford to get on a plane and drive over a border, and those who can fly, well, you're good. More double standards. We have a case in point where we had protests at Coutts. We had protests at the Ambassador Bridge. Governments, police authorities there were able to bring down the temperature. They were able to resolve that issue. Nobody called the Prime Minister and said, give us the Emergencies Act or else we can't get it done. Sûreté du Québec and the police authorities in Quebec City, they planned for the protests effectively. They calmed things down. They dealt with it appropriately. There was no need for emergency measures. So this is the kind of irresponsible behavior on the part of the government that just can't be excused. It just cannot be. This Prime Minister has tripled down for political expediency and nothing else. when he saw that he was losing. And to this day, he hasn't once taken any responsibility for this issue. The other element, colleagues, is this thing could have been resolved very quickly if this government would have done, or is willing to do, what governments across this country have been doing now for over a week, announcing that they are removing mandates. It was the easiest thing. Alberta did it, Saskatchewan did it, Ontario did it, the Quebec government did it. The only one who has tripled down and is refusing to eliminate those mandates is Prime Minister Trudeau. And at this point, we see there's no good reason for it, except he doesn't want to acknowledge political defeat. This isn't a game. This is about bringing the country that's deeply divided together. This is about reconciliation after coming out of a terrible, terrible crisis called COVID. And by the way, colleagues, make no mistake about it, this is just the beginning of disruption, because the next crisis around the corner is fundamentally worse. And this Prime Minister has buried his head in the sand regarding that one as well, and I'll get to that towards the end. But he's invoked an emergency measure, which again was unnecessary, given the police and police authorities in this country overkill, overarching authority, essentially, to do essentially what they want without any accountability to anybody. And the government leader yesterday pretty much said to us that, trust me, trust the government. There's enough evidence to justify this. I haven't seen it. He acknowledged that he hasn't seen it. I think Senator Tanis asked him about it. We haven't seen it, but the Parliament of Canada, trust me, we can freeze accounts. We can give the police all this authority to take care of what it seems to me they should be able to take care of with our present laws. And if the present laws on the books aren't sufficient to manage a few protesters in Ottawa and on Parliament Hill, we're lawmakers. Let's change the laws. Let's not tell the government, take over, be a dictatorship. Come to Parliament and say this is what we need, and we need it quickly. As you've seen, Senator Gold, we are very agile in this place over the last 2 years. Everything you've asked of your colleagues in the Senate, we've done relatively quickly. You need billions of dollars, we approved them. We need changes in order to deal with COVID, we've dealt with them even when we had reservations. We haven't pushed back. There hasn't been any hesitation. But telling police officers, go ahead and you decide who enters your parliamentary precinct, you make a list of who's appropriate to enter and who's not, I find that unbelievable. And yes, local residents were inconvenienced in a big way. Unfortunately, the frustration of Canadians has reached such a boiling point where, yes, they're causing chaos in the streets. That should be a red alert that we should sit down and find out how we can address them. That's our job. Foreign investment in this country in the last few days since the Emergency Measures Act has basically come to a standstill. We've seen it. You've seen the stats now. And it's even worse than it was before the Emergency Measures Act, which was pretty pitiful. Foreign investment in this country is at the lowest level it's been in 7 years, 8 years. So when we become the laughingstock of other Western democracies, when we're all over the front page news in the UK, in the United States, in France, in Germany, where I'm getting calls from parliamentarians and friends saying, what's happening to your great democracy? And I have no answer. I can't explain it. I can't explain that a few 100,000 people in Ottawa overcame the laws of this country, our police forces and our public security system, that we had to invoke a measure that was invoked only 3 other times in the history of this country. World War I, World War II, and of course, the October crisis. And colleagues, in each and every one of those cases where that act was invoked, history has proved there was indiscretions. History has proved that we made mistakes. We wronged people in a serious way, where governments later on had to stand up in this place and the other and apologize for those indiscretions. So it's not good enough, colleagues, to say, trust the government. It's not the role of the Senate or the House of Commons to trust the government. That's for the people to decide during elections if they want to trust them or don't trust them. This place, our job is to question them, is to see the facts before we're forced to vote on certain things. Now, we also have a Prime Minister, in addition to calling people names, he has another talent. He likes to reinvent things. Like all of a sudden, the government leader in the Senate has become the representative. Partisanship has become an evil thing in public debate. Independent parliamentarian is a parliamentarian that rubber stamps their political program and their government agenda. Extremists, racists, extreme right wing. These are all code words for anybody who opposes us. We're going to tag you. We're going to put an étiquette on you. That's, like I said, politically very astute. It's worked very well so far. I think it's slowly catching up to him. And colleagues, Prime Minister Trudeau said at the beginning of this crisis, we're all in this together. That's what he said. He said, we're going to be in this together. Unless, yeah, we have your back. But unless you're a trucker. If you're a trucker, you're on your own. Unless you're not willing to accept a medical procedure. If you're unwilling to take a vaccine, you're on your own in a big way. Unless you can't afford to fly on an airplane, you're going to be locked in your house and quarantined by this government because somehow there's different rules for those that can get on a plane and different rules for those that are going by with four wheels because they can't afford to do otherwise. I'm seeing, colleagues, unfortunately, this dangerous thing developing in our country, and it's called the bureaucratic oligarchy, where people like us, we have the privilege of a paycheck every couple of weeks, guaranteed. We have, as do all those who work for government agencies across this country. So during this COVID crisis, we saw, yeah, the government had the back of all those people. Our employees were working from home. We found ways to accommodate them. Our employees, we made sure that their paychecks were on time. So there wasn't as big a hit as those other citizens who are not part of the bureaucratic oligarchy like I am. I have that privilege. Other citizens who actually have to work in the private sector, who have been hit with a 30% pay cut, who unfortunately have lost their jobs and they're starting to feel the pain. So, colleagues, all I have to say in conclusion is the following, that we have an obligation to make sure that this divided country has some reconciliation, comes together, and recognize that we have to represent the interest of all Canadians in dealing with this crisis. Because now we're getting through the crisis of COVID, but the next one, and you all see it, go to your grocery store, and it's $200 to buy a roast to feed a family of 3 or 4. Again, the bureaucratic oligarchs, us privileged, we can afford it.
Housakis, but your time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Senator Deakin, Nova Scotia.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you, honourable colleagues, for this incredibly important and robust debate. I'm speaking to you today from Mi'kma'ki, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. Colleagues, I deeply value free speech. I deeply value peaceful protest, but these have not been peaceful protests about free speech. For example, those who came to occupy Ottawa were demanding that the federal government remove all mandates related to COVID-19, regardless of whether those mandates were issued by the American government, the Canadian government, or one of our 13 provincial or territorial governments. Then we learned that the protest organizers had the stated objective of overthrowing a recently elected government and parliament. Yet these protesters were still given the chance to voice their views peacefully on the weekend of January 29th. The voices of these protesters were definitely heard, loudly, not peacefully, but loudly. When their unreasonable and unconstitutional demands were not met, they entrenched. Day and night, the occupiers made their presence known. Where people lived, where they worked, and on the streets. Businesses were shuttered, costing an estimated $15 million in lost wages and sales every day. Lawlessness and disorder prevailed, and the citizens of businesses of Ottawa were far from alone. Countless Canadians have been harmed by the blockades of critical infrastructure across our country. These blockades disrupted billions of dollars of international and local trade. They caused struggling private businesses to close and send workers home. They damaged our most critical trading relationship at a crucial time, and they stained our global reputation. This level of instability in one of the world's most treasured democracies should be deeply concerning to all of us. Colleagues, the occupation of a G7 capital by individuals who made it clear that they are not going to respect the rule of law or leave voluntarily was untenable. Regardless of all the ineffective actions and jurisdictional failings that led up to this crisis, the Ottawa Police and the Ontario Provincial Police were clearly incapable of restoring the rule of law. As a consequence, I firmly believe that the invocation of the Emergencies Act on February 14th was both necessary and justified. Personally, I draw comfort from the checks and balances within the Act and the fact that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms remains preeminent. But we will have to listen carefully to the concerns of certain groups, especially vulnerable and minority groups who justifiably worry about precedents being set here. Canadians with a history of being marginalized, racialized, and dominated by the majority are rightfully afraid that this use of the Act could set a worrisome standard for future processes. Their fears are likely fueled by their firsthand knowledge of past police actions taken without the use of the Emergencies Act in situations that look nothing like recent events. Now I'd like to focus on the use of checks and balances within the Emergencies Act. An inquiry will be triggered when the Act is revoked, be it through the will of Parliament with the House or Senate exercising their rights under Section 59, or by a decision of this government. Canadians should rightly expect that inquiry to be thorough, balanced, and nonpartisan in its examination of, and I quote, the circumstances that led to the declaration being used and the measures taken for dealing with the emergency, end quote. Over the next year, the inquiry will call upon the Prime Minister and his cabinet to defend their use of the Act, and the people of Canada will ultimately have the opportunity to decide whether they agree with the actions taken. The inquiry will need to clear up some troubling questions leading up to the invocation of the Act, how special powers were used and why those special powers were needed in the first place. And leading up to its invocation, my questions include, in what ways did partisan language, tactics, and actions escalate tensions and anger among protesters and broaden involvement? During the first week of this crisis, Conservative MP Michael Chong and Liberal MP Joelle Lightbound both spoke powerfully about the worrisome national divisions caused and widened by partisanship as it is now practiced in Canada. For far too many, simply being anti-conservative or anti-liberal justifies saying and doing things that can only divide Canadians, not unite them. Was the required security and intelligence available to each level of government and police force leading up to and during each protest? If not, why not? What barriers did jurisdictional issues present, and how did they prevent decisive action? Why were the police limited in their ability to secure essential services? These are all, in my mind, very important questions leading up to the invocation of the Act. In terms of the powers used under the Act, I think we need to carefully examine issues that include the following. What burden of proof existed prior to freezing the roughly 200 personal and corporate bank accounts and 250 crypto addresses? How many accounts were frozen in error? And how quickly and completely were these situations resolved? What process was used to release the affected individual and corporate accounts so that these individuals do not remain unbanked and uninsured? The actions taken could cause significant financial harm, potentially to people who have not broken the law, but also to those people that we don't want to become less connected to broader society. I trust that this inquiry will examine how quickly and completely each one of these situations was resolved. Lastly, I want us to examine why we got to the point where the Emergencies Act was required to access crucial financial measures. Specifically, I hope the inquiry will examine issues that include, first, why is our financial oversight system not capable of monitoring the financial activities used during these occupations without invoking the Emergencies Act? The organizers showed sophistication in rapidly raising and distributing a large number of donations, including those made using crypto assets. But these activities used are not very new, and their use was far from unimaginable. Yet these activities remain unregulated. Our regulations and corresponding due process have got to start to keep up with market realities. This crisis has caused new payment technologies and platforms to be added to our list of regulated financial entities. But the fact that it took a crisis for this to happen is troubling. Second, why have we failed to revamp our approach to anti-money laundering and anti-terrorist financing, despite FinTrack's existing protocols capturing less than 1% of estimated criminal money flows in Canada? How has this not been a priority? The status quo means that bad actors are 99% successful in moving their money in Canada. Our current system is a burden for good actors and fails to track bad actors unless we use the Emergencies Act. This is an unacceptable reality. Third, how are we incapable of identifying and regulating foreign funding coming into Canada for political, ideological, or illegal purposes? Why have new regulations and appropriate processes not been prioritized in the digital era? Simply, our financial regulators have not kept up with technological and market realities. Canada has stagnated as disruption has accelerated. Highly disruptive point-of-sale technologies using crypto payments now exist, yet we still are not thoughtfully building a financial system that will keep up with market realities. We have got to start to prioritize data rights, financial inclusiveness, and global competitiveness while protecting the freedom in financial decision-making and dramatically limiting the role of bad actors. This is no small task. With each of these issues, I worry about how much legislative work is needed, but in an environment where Canadians' trust in their public and political institutions has been weakened, and their faith in what they see on social media only seems to grow. This is deeply worrisome. Rebuilding lost trust must be a top priority. It might be helped by prioritizing the use of consultative ways to engage Canadians in building shared solutions to shared problems, and eliminate the paternalistic Ottawa knows best approach where Canadians are given a predetermined solution to a pre-selected problem. Colleagues, throughout our country, Canadians have continued to do their jobs, but they are stressed, tired, and worn out. But they continued to work. I'm grateful for the million-plus Canadians who have struggled, tired, and without reprieve to keep our healthcare system from collapsing through this crisis. I'm grateful for the 130,000 truckers who have continued to provide deliveries across our country day in and day out. I'm grateful for the countless essential workers who remain heroes despite no longer receiving their hero pay. I'm grateful to the journalists who protect our democracy by constantly searching for the light of truth, and I'm grateful for the police, first responders, business owners, and ordinary citizens who keep our communities functioning. I'm grateful that all of these Canadians have continued to do their jobs. Colleagues, I believe now is the time for the Canadian politicians to lower the temperature, drop the partisan rhetoric, and focus on building a more sustainable, inclusive, and prosperous path forward for all Canadians. That's our job. I worry if we don't do it. Thank you, colleagues.
Sénatrice Bellemare, en débat.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank all senators who took the floor throughout these discussions that were well thought out and well felt. I also want to thank Senator Gold, who answered our questions in a very remarkable way. Let me express my concerns about the emotion I'm shared between the arguments for and against, and I share the concerns that were expressed by Senators Patterson, Senator Méville-Deschênes, and all those who, like me, are confused. But let me say something. For Quebecers listening to us and who have been who suffered the Wars Act in 1970, the Emergencies Act cannot be compared to the war measures. It's a lot lighter than the 1970 Act. The Charter of Rights did not exist at the time, and civil liberties were violated in Quebec. Such political attacks will no longer be possible with the Emergencies Act, particularly because of parliamentary and judicial controls that are incorporated in the law. I would also like to underscore that in this concern, I'm totally convinced that the forces of law had to intervene to stop the occupation of the Ottawa downtown, as they had to do to ensure safety on the Ambassador Bridge. The demonstrators interfered with the liberties of people and had significant economic consequences. But the successful intervention in Windsor raised some questions. If the law was not necessary in that case, why will it be necessary in the downtown Ottawa context. We did not clearly receive those answers. The Emergency Measures Act was introduced on February 14th, and downtown Ottawa was cleared of occupants last weekend. I understand that the people of Ottawa, and in particular all the individuals and families who live in downtown Ottawa, have suffered from this occupation. I sympathize with them. A majority of Canadians agree with the use of the Emergency Measures Act. Some of the scenes during the occupation of downtown Ottawa, such as the installation of temporary hot tubs and supply buildings, which were incredible in themselves, outraged many Canadians who realized that many of the protesters were there to stay for a long time. It was high time to act. Today, in principle, the occupation is over. We no longer need this law, which contains a set of measures which are rather difficult, particularly the financial measures, freezing of bank accounts. Even though the law specifies in its preamble that the measures are subject to the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, some measures raise some questions. In particular, the economic measures included in the proclamation allow financial institutions to freeze the bank funds of persons considered to have violated the law. Is it certain that they will withstand legal challenges? The future will tell us. Where does my hesitation come from with respect to the motion before us? We are responding to events born of the frustrations created by the suspension of many freedoms over the past 2 years, by a law that suspends even more freedoms, because even though many of the organizers of the occupation seem to belong to extreme right-wing groups, they have received the sympathy of many Canadians, frustrated by the confinement measures and the division created in families and communities. I cannot ignore the context in which the use of the measures was made, which was the loss of freedoms during the pandemic. For 2 years, the containment measures adopted in the context of the pandemic have had real effects on the state of democracy in the world. In this regard, let me highlight the words of the Democracy Index 2020, published by the British magazine The Economist. And let me quote some paragraphs.
Of civil liberties, attacks on freedom of expression, and the failure of democratic accountability that occurred as a result of the pandemic in 2020 are grave matters. This is why the scores for many questions in the civil liberties category and the functioning of the government category of the Democracy Index were downgraded across multiple countries in 2020. Regardless of whether there was public support for the government measures, countries that withdrew civil liberties or failed to allow proper scrutiny of new emergency powers were penalized. Fin de la citation.
End of quote. All countries have adopted similar measures to combat the pandemic. Measures borrowed from the Chinese model, which was the first country affected. In short, the document produced by The Economist states that the methods in authoritarian and democratic countries have been the same, considering that China was the first affected country, and also considering that there were no other examples. With the exception of a few countries like Sweden, before the advent of vaccines, there was nothing else that democratic countries could do, maybe. In Quebec, the use of the curfew, an extreme measure, was used on several occasions. Only recently, in January 2022, it wasn't well received by some people, and I think it was the last drop that created lots of frustrations amongst the adult population, amongst people, particularly amongst the young. And I can talk a lot about this. But let's come back to the Democracy Index for Canada in particular, and I quote The Economist once again.
To score highly in 2020 Democracy Index, thanks to the country's history of stable democratic government. Canada's political participation score rose to its highest level ever in 2020, propelling Canada into the top 5 countries in the global ranking for the first time. Alors, c'est un accomplissement.
That was an achievement. However, even though Canada is amongst the most democratic countries in the world, there's a point on which it lost points. And let me quote again.
Restrictions led to a deterioration in the functioning of government score in Canada. Alors, les restrictions, effectivement, nous ont empêché.
The restrictions prevented us from playing our role as we should have, as we normally did normally. The pandemic had a real impact on democracy in the world and in Canada as well. We must be aware of that and most often take action to protect our democracy. Let me add that countries that had the highest scores were the Scandinavian countries. That being said, these are my questions. Are we going to renew emergency measures that are still liberticidal in a context where individual freedoms have already been attacked greatly in Canada during the pandemic? Even though we want to go back to a normal life, without knowing if the act is necessary. As Senator Delphine said, this may set a dangerous precedent that sets a low bar for invoking emergency legislation some other time. Are we impoverishing the expression of our democratic reflexes? The Senate is a place of second thought. We are not here to govern in the place of the government. But it is difficult to endorse a step in the void. It is temporary, however. It's 30 days. But as Senator Cotter explained, this measure is desired by a majority of Canadians. It will not apply in my province unless the Premier of Quebec decides otherwise. It has been adopted by a majority of MPs in the House of Commons. Not to ratify this measure in the Senate, which is endorsed by most people, will surely create significant political tension. Finally, as Senator Cotter said, I am not sure that we have the legitimacy to not give the government the benefit of doubt at this time. Particularly, as I said a while ago, this act would soon end. We can track this file and ensure that a full investigation is done 60 days after the end of the emergency measures and that a parliamentary committee is quickly put in place. These provisions do not exist in the previous act. In conclusion, I hope sincerely that Canada will take its cue from the countries that have had one of the highest indices of democracy, namely the Scandinavian countries. Having studied many of their public policies, part of their recipe is a spirit of consultation and social dialogue that animates these societies. Our confederation needs institutions that allow for better consultation between governments and social dialogue with civil society. The obligation to resort to emergency measures might not have been necessary with more consultation between the various levels of government. The adoption of the emergency measures speaks volumes about the poverty of our institutions of consultation and social dialogue in Canada. And in times of polarization of ideas, we need institutions of consultation and social dialogue to combat the polarization that accompanies misinformation. As you know, consultation, dialogue enable us to share the same information and to strengthen our common values. For now, dear colleagues, considering all that, I believe that I will give the government the benefit of doubt. For now, thank you.
On debate, Senator Tanis.
Thank you, Speaker. I'd like to start by thanking It's in moments like these, situations like these that occur rarely in our chamber, but with some regularity, I guess, over my 9 years. I'm reminded of the incredible talent and wisdom that we have in this chamber. I say often to people that Canadians should read the biographies and tune in once in a while to the Senate. Truly, this has been a tremendous debate. I have to say I'm envious of the certainty with which people have put forward their positions. With disciplined arguments advanced by both sides. In fact, there was an excellent juxtaposition of that with Senator Arnott and Senator Marshall, who had opposite plans and both made what I found to be powerful presentations for their position. I find myself out of my element. Doesn't happen very often to me. I find myself almost detached in a surreal situation, like an observer. I've always been able to draw on my personal and professional experience, but it's always been anchored and confirmed by the values of my family and my community. This isn't available to me today. My community, my country, is divided, severely divided. We can't have a discussion about anything anymore because we can't even agree on the facts. This is a very, very distressing time in Canada. I'm not seeing leadership. I'm not seeing leadership to bring us together. I'm not seeing leadership from any quarter, whether it is the Prime Minister's office or the Leader of the Opposition's office, or premiers. It's no wonder that we continue down this path. I'd like to thank the truckers of Canada. According to the Canadian Trucking Association, there are 320,000 Canadians working in the trucking industry. It's about 2% of the entire workforce in Canada. Day in and day out, they deliver food and goods of all sorts to and from Canada, to and from neighborhoods, to and from homes. During COVID, we actually relied more on their work. We asked them to do more than they usually do. We all bought stuff and had it delivered to our homes that we would normally have gone somewhere and purchased. For much of the time, they did it with no vaccines. Nobody had a vaccine available to them. They did it anyway. Their work is difficult, and in many cases, it's solitary. They're by themselves. It's often dangerous. Road conditions, traffic conditions. I want to say to the truckers of Canada, you are appreciated, you're valued, and you're respected. Your collective reputation has been appropriated by many people and many organizations for their own purposes in this unsettled time. But reasonable people recognize that. I want to thank peace officers who showed remarkable skill and restraint and determination over the past few weeks as they restored necessarily the public order in Coots, at the Ambassador Bridge, other places, but especially here in Ottawa. 2 weeks ago, I had the opportunity on a couple of occasions to walk through the Ottawa Convoy protest site on Wellington Street. Anyone who visited that site could not help but notice that this particular protest was populated by people from across the country, coast to coast to coast, as people like to say. They were represented by many cultures and creeds and political perspectives, some of them wacky, but the vast majority of them represented by millions of Canadians. You know, I have to say that I followed some of the media coverage as the convoy started out west and rolled towards Ottawa. I didn't follow it closely. The media presented it as a ragtag group of Westerners that were coming to Ottawa. We've heard it in discussions similar to the Yellow Vest and the energy support group that came from the West, and they were on their way to Ottawa. And so I was very surprised when I arrived up on the hill to find that the vast majority of trucks that were parked there were from Quebec and Ontario. I couldn't find an Alberta truck, actually, on Wellington Street. I have not heard one word from anyone in the media about the fact that that protest was national in nature. I have never heard anybody say, how did these crazy Albertans that have been arrested manage to communicate with all these people in Quebec, if this is a conspiracy, to come to Ottawa on this day? It strains credibility to believe that those folks, because I don't believe any of them speak French or have a network in Quebec, were able to convince that many truckers from that province, and I'm using it as an example, to come to Ottawa. The fact is, it was a groundswell of support from across this country. It's that simple. Millions of Canadians identified with the protest. Millions of Canadians still feel the way that they did when they identified with that protest. Thousands upon thousands of Canadians gave $10 and $5 and $20 to that crowdfunding site because it made them feel good that they had a hand in supporting what was going to be a protest in Ottawa against continued government intrusion in their lives after the last 2 years. I don't believe that it is any more complicated than that, but we'll see. You know, the sad irony of what happened on February the 15th when the Emergencies Act was invoked is that people who were here to protest intrusion by the government in their lives, the answer to the problem was more intrusion in their lives through the Emergencies Act. It's brought the temperature up. But I agree with Senator St. Germain. I agree with Senator Marshall and others. It should never, ever have come to what it did come to. A 3-week illegal occupation should never have been allowed to occur. There's lots of blame to go around, and the inquiry that will follow, I hope, is unflinching in assigning that blame where it belongs, finding out the facts and assigning responsibility. And I hope that the people and the organizations that are found to have been wanting take responsibility for it. Nonetheless, colleagues, I believe that the government made a decision to invoke the Act based on facts in their possession in a very volatile situation. And in that moment, they did their job. They made a decision, and I believe they made it responsibly. That decision was made 9 days ago. Since then, the Coutts protest, the Ambassador Bridge protest, and the Ottawa blockades and occupations have been stopped. The streets have been cleared. Traffic is going on Wellington Street and on the other streets as it was before. There's been a cleanup, and there's been preventative measures that need to be instituted, and I have every faith that the police and the relevant authorities will make those measures preventative measures. Senator Gold made a defense of why we need to continue the Emergencies Act today, why it needs to continue. But I don't believe that we are anywhere near any kind of definition of a national security emergency here today on February the 23rd. Canadians are divided about the use of the Emergencies Act. There's no question about that. A few days ago, in fact, after the invocation, there was a poll conducted by Main Street Research which highlight this fact. 39% of Canadians strongly oppose the Emergencies Act and its use now. It's repugnant to many of those people. 38% strongly agree with the invocation of the Emergencies Act. And the rest of the folks either somewhat oppose or somewhat support or don't have an opinion. So 39 to 38 means we're divided. The majority is divided. So I think we need, at this moment in time, to consider this motion not for its utility in approving a decision that happened 9 days ago. I think we need to consider whether or not this divisive action is still needed today. So, with all of that, on these insufficient words, and I will leave it there, I will vote no to the continuation of the Emergencies Act on the basis that I believe it is no longer needed and it is doing nothing but dividing Canadians and will do so in increasing numbers every day, every hour that it is in force. Thank you.
Question? Senator Coyle?
Would Senator Tanis take a question?
Yes.
Thank you, Senator Tanis, and thank you so much for your thoughtful remarks. I always, I think like everyone here, pay attention when you get up because we know you have considered the matter at hand with great seriousness. So I thank you for your speech today. And you know, it's something, as you have said, all of us are grappling with a very serious matter that is before us. This is a serious matter. The divisions that you have mentioned and others have mentioned as central to what caused the situation we are now in are matters of great concern. I have a concern related to, and coming to the question, to the poll that you just cited, showing almost even numbers of Canadians who are supportive of the Emergencies Act and those who are against it. What I worry about is, probably on both sides, do they know what it is? And I'm particularly actually worried about those who are against it, because I do believe and know for a fact, because of what's been coming at me in all those emails, or in many, many, many of the emails we've been receiving, is that many people in Canada have been fed, unfortunately, a message that this is, in fact, the War Measures Act, the draconian War Measures Act that was invoked twice in Canada's history, not 3 times, twice in Canada's history. This is a new act, a very different act, and I know there's a nuance there that is very hard for Canadians to understand, and therefore leaves people susceptible to deception. Could you speak to that?
Senator Tanis.
Yes, I can. I think it's never been used, this particular act, since its creation in 1988. That speaks for itself. We've gone all these years, more than 30 years, without it needing to be used. We've been through some difficult times in our country. 9/11 is one that jumps to mind and has been mentioned here. It's never been used. I think Canadians know that it is not a piece of legislation that is meant to be used lightly, and that it does impinge on freedoms. And I think they know it on both sides. I agree with you. I think the nomenclature can be torqued depending on which, what argument you want to make. So I don't think it's. I think it highlights the issue and probably highlights the division. There are people who believe that rare exceptions like this should never be used and should never be normalized. And there are others who have believed that what happened in Ottawa was made it necessary. I don't know. To me, it is an example of the alternate facts, the torquing. I'll give you another example that, to me, I think bothers me. It bothers me when I looked up and down Wellington Street at the protest that was there. I've said it needed to be broken up, but that was not a group of white supremacists and racists. It had some in it. There's always going to be some wackos that attach to every protest. There's been, I don't even need to get into that. But that was the narrative of our government, of our leader. I was enormously uncomfortable with that, disappointed with that, just as I was disappointed with others who went and stood with people, not with ideas, but with the people that were doing something illegal in the streets of Ottawa. I don't know if I answered your question, but that was my best shot.
Senator Cotter, a question?
Would Senator Tanis take one more question?
Sure.
This is a difficult question for me to ask, Senator Tanis, and I generally don't do this. I did appreciate the heartfelt nature of your remarks, and I'm in many respects entirely sympathetic with them. My question, I guess, is that if we all were to agree with you, we would all vote no to this motion. But the problem with voting no, it seems to me, is that it's impossible to distinguish whether we are sending a message that the emergency should have never been declared or it was legitimate to declare but should be canceled out now. And I'm sympathetic to that tension. So I want to ask you this question. The legislation contemplates a power in us, with 20 senators to sign it, to initiate a process to bring this to an end. So I guess I'm inviting the question of whether to meet the description and the goal that you have in mind, we ought to endorse the emergency resolution and declaration and then move for its revocation. By that, we would state the legitimacy of the resolution, but the need for it to now be canceled. And I guess I'm interested in knowing whether that's a better course in our consideration of the very points that you made. Thanks.
Senator Tanis.
Thank you, and I actually really wanted to, I wrestled with that myself. But here's the conclusion I came to. Nobody's asking our permission to invoke. It's already been invoked. It's in play for 9 days. If we don't make a decision on this, it will continue to be in play for the next 20-odd days till it expires. So I don't feel somehow obligated to make the two-step process, given the fact that I wasn't asked. We weren't asked for permission. And the Act's fairly clear that if we reject, it's canceled, but all the other things carry on, the inquiry, etc. So it probably had some intention. I don't know. I haven't read Hansard. But it probably, there was an intention to have this process such that it could be stopped after having been invoked and used, and that parliamentarians, in their wisdom, would recognize that it was no longer needed. You know, so that's, I would not suggest to anybody here that you need to be troubled about granting your permission for what nobody asked for permission on 9 days ago. As the reason not, if you feel strongly about having it stopped today, because the 10-senator program will take many, many days. Frankly, I predict that if we start the process, and I will be, like Senator McFedrin and others, I am a ready signatory to that process. It'll take us into next week. We'll have a debate. I doubt it will come to that. Speaking personally, my bet is that the NDP members of Parliament will be back at home right now, visiting with their family and friends and communities. Will come back here on Monday and initiate the process themselves. And the government and the police will suddenly figure out that they have found the way to do it without the Emergencies Act, and it'll be revoked. We'll put that on the record as a bet. But if not, I will willingly participate in the next step. Thank you.
Senator Simons. Senator Simons.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Senator Tanis, would you take another question?
Senator Simons.
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much, Senator Tanis. Like you, I find myself envious of the certainty of some of our colleagues, and like you, I am deeply troubled about the precedent set by the invocation of the Emergencies Act. And like you, I am still making up my mind. But I do have a question I wanted to ask about your assertion that you saw no white supremacists involved in the occupation in Ottawa, and your comment yesterday that nobody had been hurt as a result of this. The Coutts border arrests, which happened, south of where you live, but in your larger backyard, certainly give me pause. The police seizure of that many firearms, that much ammunition, the markings of the Diagolon white supremacist group with those weapons. And I'm wondering whether we aren't being a bit naive when we say, well, nobody got hurt, and it was just there were just a few wackos who attached themselves to this, when it seems to me that at the base of this protest was a very dark, very ugly, and very worrisome trend in this country that we need to be paying much more attention to.
Tanis.
Well, first of all, I think I said that nobody wound up in the hospital. I think we all saw a lady that got hit by a horse and got back up. I got back up and was interviewed, and that's. Can you imagine? And by the way, my comment was not necessarily about the virtue of those that were at the barricades. It was more around the discipline of the police and the tactics that they deployed in order to safely bring the Ottawa protest to an end. To your question about and you could be right. I mean, I don't know the people from Alberta that have been pointed at as the ringleaders in all of this. I don't know what their motives were in starting it, but I can tell you that the millions of people that expressed sympathy and support in one form or another saw something in that gave voice to their frustration or part of their frustration. So I don't know whether, in truth, whether the protest was co-opted by ordinary Canadians with very real frustrations, or whether the convoy of real Canadians with real frustrations was somewhat co-opted by a very small group of people. I looked when I walked up and down there. I could not see flags. I sure saw a lot of flags. In first place was the Canadian flag by a mile. In second place was a flag that had a comment about our Prime Minister and a maple leaf on it. And I really, anything else could not have been said to be prominent. The placards up and down that were attached to the fence overwhelmingly were about personal freedoms and vaccination. I guess I don't know how. I can't comment. It's not in my area of expertise as to whether or not white supremacists are on the rise or on the wane or the same as they've always been. I think, in a free society, we're always going to have those kind of people, and they're always going to be around, and we always need to stand up to them in whatever form is necessary.
Senator Dalphon.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Senator Tanas take another question?
Because I'm going to do it in French. Alors, je voudrais vous remercier pour.
Thank you for your comments. I understood them well. A while ago, you said we had to look at the situation from the date of today, and that's also my understanding of the law. If from the 9 days ago and the date today, if we discover that some bank accounts were frozen and there were some interruptions in bank transactions following the introduction of the economic measures, it will be surprising for the Senate to confirm the declaration and later on start a process the week following to annul the regulation, asking for an end of the application of those measures. If I understood you well, what you are saying is that we should look at the situation as it stands today, including the impact that the declaration has had, some of which were positive, some of which were negative, before we take a stand. Did I understand you well, Senator Tanas?
I understand your point. However, there may be senators who are persuaded. I'm sure the government leader will be working furiously to make sure that people are persuaded that this must be confirmed, and then there is a process by which we can remove it, that we shouldn't conflate the two. And I believe there will be people who will be persuaded by that. So if you believe that and acknowledge that, and I think that is real, and it is every senator's right to make their decisions and on what basis they're going to make it, having made that, whenever we vote, there may be a different decision that gets made 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 days from now if we're still in this emergency measures, if it persists, that they could again turn their minds to it, free of the fact that they've confirmed the original thing. I've done it in my speech. I've confirmed the original, and I'm saying it's time to end it now. And I'm glad you said the law is on my side with this. I didn't know that, but I'm glad it is. Thank you.
Senator Moody.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've gotten an answer to the question that I had. Thank you very much.
Pate.
Thank you very much. Like Senator Simons, I too am still struggling, as you could probably tell from my comments yesterday. Many of us are extremely concerned that once this is done in this kind of circumstance, and I didn't mention it last night, but I share your incredible appreciation for the restraint that the state showed, that the police showed in this instance, at least in everything we could see and what was televised. Certainly I've heard from folks that there were other things happening that weren't televised, but everything we saw was incredible restraint, unlike what we've seen in many protesters involving Canadians of African descent, Indigenous folks throughout this country, land and water protectors, and so, as well as other protests. And so I'm extremely concerned, like you, that once done, how often can this be redone in the name of, particularly given whoever might be in power who might choose to abuse such power, state power. I'm interested in whether you think the inquiry happening, which you talked about, is sufficient to ensure that we have the kind of accountability that you spoke about that we need to have in this country when we talk about using such incredible measures like the Emergencies Act, or whether you think we need to actually, and I take from what you've said that you would be part of and be able to participate in a group that would call for the immediate revocation of the Act if it should pass this House, pass this chamber. What do you see as the way forward? I agree with you about the lack of leadership. What do you see as the way forward, and how do we bring this country together at this point, in your opinion, which I value?
Senator Tanis.
I think one of the things that has to happen is what Senator Husakos said. This is a moment when political points and your calculations about how to score it need to go out the window when we actually do the review of what happened. That those committee members need to be focused on what really happened and making sure that everybody who had a role to play and didn't play it, or who played a role they shouldn't have, is enumerated, and it's brought to the light of day. And if that will go with not just the committee, but the selection of who goes into the committee. Leaders will have a responsibility. They will have a job of appointing people to that committee. Caucuses will have some role in that in the House of Commons, and I speak specifically about the House of Commons. So if you're sending your political spin master into that committee to make sure that it all comes out to your advantage, we're sunk right from the beginning. So there is a moment before that committee starts where I think leadership has to begin. And I would hope that the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition and the caucuses and the NDP and the Bloc Québécois and all of us here would take that first step of leadership and put somebody in who has the expertise, the guts, and the willingness to work with others to make sure that a proper accounting of this takes place.
Senator Gold. Senator Gold. Oh, sorry. Senator Page, you had another question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Senator Tanis. Would you take a supplementary question? That's in the short term, absolutely. You mentioned, and a number of us have spoken about the longer term issues and the fact that this is decades in the making, the state and the situation we're in today. Would you agree that there's a need to really look at, and one of the next pieces of legislation we'll be looking at will be trying to fix some of those who were left behind, the elderly during this period? Do you believe we also need to be looking at the fundamental fabric, the social, economic, and health frameworks that exist to support people in this country?
Senator Tanis.
Look, I think this is a very dangerous time. We have, over the last 6 years, spent an enormous amount of time, I have, listening and considering and advancing the rights of lots of minorities who have been waiting for their time to get recognized. If I was a leader of a minority, if I was in that position, I would be very worried. And the reason I would be worried is that the majority is at war with each other. They've split. In order, I believe, for minority rights to be properly recognized and protected, it falls to the majority to do it. And if the majority is dysfunctional, then God help the minority. We have work to do to heal the divide, this large divide, the 40-40 divide, 39-38 divide, whatever you want to call it, that exists in this country. I think before we can go anywhere, we're as gridlocked as Wellington Street was during the protest. That's got to get fixed. It's going to take some time, and it's going to take goodwill. And there will be lots of places along the way where I believe minorities will need to help the majority get back to to find common ground. They will need to call out bad behavior on all sides, not just the side that maybe they perceive is most helpful to them in the moment. We have to bring people together. You know, Senator Housakos once said something to me, and I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, but he said, "Hey, I'm Greek. We argue." And I took that as, look, this is politics. This is a political institution, Parliament. We came here to disagree and to talk, but to find common ground and to always respect each other. We've got to start modeling that behavior if we are going to advance our country and every single citizen in it.
Senator Gold.
Thank you, Your Honor. Would you take a question, Senator Tanis?
Yes.
Thank you. At least you only have 45 minutes. Senator Tanis, thank you very much for your speech, delivered as always soberly and sensibly and with thought. As representative of the government, I appreciate very much your statement in the course of your speech that you confirmed that the government made the right decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. Nothing not done easily. You seem to assume, however, in your remarks that were the Senate to confirm that decision that the act would persist for 20 days. But in fact, as the government has been saying, and as I've said in this chamber as recently as yesterday, the government is reconsidering this hour by hour. It was cautious, indeed reluctant to invoke it, and but if the government made the right decision, prudent, cautious decision to invoke it, the question is this: do you doubt that the government, which is committed to be reviewing it on a regular basis, would you doubt that the cabinet would not make the right decision when taking the advice of the law enforcement professionals that's informed this process all the way through, when they put their minds, as they do regularly, to whether it should end? So my question is really simple. why do you think the government will be any less cautious, prudent, or responsible in the decision they have undertaken to review on an hourly basis?
Senator Tanis.
Well, first of all evidence to the contrary. The streets are clear. The emergency is over here in Ottawa. I accept that there was no way that conventional policing with the laws on the books could have done what needed to be done to encircle 100 square blocks and deny people entry and exit, to do what they needed to do in all of the other elements that are well enumerated to break the back of that protest that had metastasized over 3 weeks. I accept that. There's lots of blame, and we'll get to the blame as to whose fault it was, doesn't matter. How could they have done it? And I believe that drastic decision had to be made. But today, to say that we need to continue an act that has been told to Canadians is the absolute last thing, that it must continue today, must continue in the next hour, hour after that, hour after that. When the purpose that it was invoked for, the clear purpose it was invoked for, which was here in Ottawa, that purpose has is no longer. That purpose has been dealt with. That is the issue. We have a fully functioning intelligence department. We have the RCMP. In this province, you've got the Ontario Provincial Police and you've got the municipal police. They didn't all go home. They've been working hard. They have laws and resources available to them. And there is nothing that I have heard that tells me that they still need that. We heard today, in fact, that we heard yesterday that there were all these bank accounts and, or what are they called? Banking products, financial products that had been frozen. And now we hear that they're starting to be unfrozen. Not that there's new ones. No new ones, just that the ones that were frozen. So it leads me to believe that the measures, the extra measures that are so repugnant to Canadians because they were told that this law was to be used once in a generation maybe, that the powers in that law need to continue. It doesn't square. And I have not heard anything that convinces me otherwise. We heard from you about, and others, about the financial side of things. We heard about a bunch of truckers that are circling Ottawa or parked in a field somewhere waiting to come back as soon as the Emergency Act is revoked. Presumably this time the police have a plan if that happens. Or I guess if they don't, then we'll have to invoke it again. But it doesn't need to continue today. It should be put back in the closet where it belongs. Thank you.
Osakis.
Or, of course, the government can just lift the remaining mandates like everyone else is, and they'll never come back, at least for this issue. And you're absolutely right, Senator Tanis. You and I, we engage in debate here for many years, and sometimes we agree, sometimes we disagree, but we respect our opinion. And you're right. I am a Greek, and of course, the word democracy, of course, demos is people, and kratia means rule of the people. That's what democracy is all about, and we should never forget that. I appreciate your interventions and your comments, and I agree with you and Senator Pate that by and large, this was a huge protest, but very tempered, very peaceful, and we have to give kudos to the police forces and the public security forces and the protesters because they found a way to protest, but yet when the police had to do what they had to do, they They backed up and they retrenched, then they backed up and they accepted the final finale while getting their point across. Where we've had, as Senator Pate has said, other protests in the city, Black Lives Matter, Indigenous protests, very legitimate protests, where in my own city there were commercial violence, there were statues being desecrated. So my concern, will this precedent, if we don't put an end to it or set parameters and send a message to this government and future governments that this should not be a precedent, that every time the people rise up in frustration and there is some measured violence or there's some stretching of law and order, as we know in this country, because they want to express their democratic frustration, that other governments won't use this as a precedent in order to do something as draconian on environmental groups, indigenous groups, and others who will have legitimate reason to protest. And the final question is, we're a great federation. As you brought up, public security is a responsibility of municipalities, provinces, and governments in collaboration. Did we get any indication that provinces, municipal authorities were calling on the government to do this? It seems like there's at least 7 out of 10 provincial governments that have been outraged by this measure. Can you comment on both the precedent that this sets in terms of future protests, and why would the government do something when there hasn't been a call by other levels of government to ask for this across the country?
Excuse me, Senator Tanis. I'm sure you want to answer this question, but your time has expired, and there are a couple of other senators who want to ask. Are you asking for 5 more minutes? Or?
No.
No. Time is. Thank you. Senator Toulajan.
Thank you, Speaker. Honourable Senators, I rise today to speak on the Emergencies Act. Its invocation is a testament to our government's failure to control protests happening on its doorsteps. Canadians are asking for leadership to guide them through the 3rd year of a pandemic and countrywide protests, but were abandoned for 3 weeks only to learn that our government has invoked an act against its own citizens. My office has, like most of the senators' offices, been receiving numerous emails and phone calls about the convoy. There had been growing concerns about the so-called freedom protesters who are fighting for and consequently taking away freedom from fellow Canadians. News of protesters taking over the nation's capital has gone viral worldwide, damaging Canada's reputation. Family and friends from around the world have reached out, trying to understand what is happening in our country. As an advocate for human rights, I will always support the right to protest peacefully. At some point, this peaceful demonstration took a turn for the worse, and we started witnessing swastikas, Confederate flags, and even the Islamophobic 3%ers flag, a designated terrorist group by the Government of Canada. I heard stories of racialized parliamentary staff requiring escorts to enter their workplace. I also heard of women who stopped wearing a mask when leaving their home out of fear. While protesters have insisted their rights are under threat, I cannot help but wonder who is protecting the rights of the ordinary citizens of Ottawa. But what particularly worries me is this precedent this invocation sets. The Emergency Act allows the federal government to bypass ordinary democratic process. And according to the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, the government has not met the threshold necessary to invoke this act. The executive director fears that normalizing emergency legislation threatens our democracy and our civil liberties. And on Thursday, February the 17th, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association announced they would legally challenge the use of the Emergencies Act. These emergency measures, I would like to specify, affect every single Canadian. Unlike the Prime Minister's assurances, these measures are not focused on certain areas. They are applied to the entire country. Already the Act will be used to broaden the scope of financing laws and allow government agencies and banks to share relevant information with the police, and this is only the beginning. I also worry about a lack of respect and adherence to our Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Of course, the Special Parliamentary Review Committee will be established to review the government's action under the Act. The committee's insights might come too late, as it appears to be a retroactive evaluation. Every measure under the Act must be scrutinized, weighed, and discussed to ensure the respect of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. More importantly, I fear the sweeping powers of the Emergencies Act may turn against racialized Canadians, such as the Canadian Muslim community of which I am part. Since 2001, my community has been excessively targeted by Canadian authorities and fellow citizens alike. Recent Islamophobic attacks have only shown that we are not safe. And according to the National Council of Canadian Muslims, who in reaction to this act said that we must preserve our right to protest while working with civil society to better understand what these emergency powers mean for the future of protest and to reinforce our charter rights. Mustafa Farooq, the CEO of the National Council of Canadian Muslims, or NCCM, shared a press release in response to the Emergencies Act. And he said, here I quote, "His Canadian Muslims are all too familiar with having community organizations, funds, initiatives be perceived with the suspicion by the security establishment. Many of us have questions that must be answered through a process that is transparent and not driven by partisan interests." End of quote. Of course, handling a protest in the nation's capital is no small feat, but the current chosen route is not one of unity. Multiple provinces have voiced their concerns and have clearly stated they're against these drastic measures. The Emergencies Act gives the federal cabinet unprecedented power to assume jurisdiction from the provinces and municipalities, which goes against the basic principles of responsible government under the Westminster tradition. Canadian provinces have worked hard since Confederation to enhance the status and peculiarities of their provincial governments. They now face an oligarchy and the disappearance of hard-earned powers. The Prime Minister had a choice to extinguish the flames of dissent weeks ago and defuse the situation. The government's lack of response to the protests and reliance on the Emergencies Act have put us at risk of severe, lasting repercussions on Canadian society for years to come. Only time will tell if our democracy will be better because of it. In the meantime, the protests are over, the roads are clear. So tell me, why do we still need the Emergencies Act? And like Senator Tannis, I was also very disturbed by the lack of leadership. Canadians were left on their own wondering where the government was. Canadians were looking to the Prime Minister for reassurance that everything would be well. But the Prime Minister was missing. He wasn't there when Canadians needed him most. But what he did was he invoked the Emergencies Act. And, honourable senators, for these reasons, I will not be supporting the Emergency Act, and I will be voting no. Thank you.
Senator Pate?
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Toulajan. When Senator Hosaka spoke, he actually slightly misrepresented, I think, what I had said. I had talked about the concerns with protests like the Indigenous protests and Black Lives Matter, the concerns about the use of force, of state force against them. You also mentioned the concern you have about when, whether it's people of Muslim faith or those of African descent or Indigenous people speak out. I just want to confirm that that's one of the concerns, not that, in fact, it is those protesters who would cause harm, but, in fact, it's state harm that often comes to them when we invoke these kinds of emergency acts.
Senator Toulajan.
Senator, what I am saying and what I'm reacting to is what I've been hearing from the community, who are really, really concerned that this Emergency Act will do nothing to protect some of the minorities. And I guess, Senator Osakis, I don't think you misrepresented. I thought he was talking about, protection of everyone. But I agree with you. We have to be really, really vigilant. And the other issue is that here I talk about my community, as that a lot of them have come from countries where they didn't necessarily have the freedom to speak. They didn't know their rights. And I know of cases where things have happened and there's been excessive force used, and the community didn't know what recourse they had. I am here representing Canadians but a certain community who look to me for answers, and they've been calling me, and they've expressed their concern. What does this do for this act do for our protection? And like the National Council of Muslims said, but we also need to have the right to protest peacefully. And I want to acknowledge that this was a peaceful demonstration. Somehow along the way it turned. And I also want to acknowledge that the police did show great restraint. I mean, we were all glued to our TV sets, just wondering what was happening in Ottawa.
Senator Pate?
Just supplementary. So you would share the concern that many of us, that regardless of which party formed the government, there would be concern about not using this against individuals in a way that would actually reinforce stereotypes and discriminatory attitudes.
Yes, I would.
Thank you.
Senator Ousakos?
Yeah, I don't think I misrepresented at all. I think Senator Pate and I are on the same page, and I just want to clarify what you're saying, Senator Toulajan, is what I believe I hear from you, is that any group of protesters in this country, environmentalists, indigenous groups, Black Lives Matter, people that are anti-mandates, that they will have that fundamental right to do it without the threat of this draconian hammer being dropped in the future. And what I'm trying to get across is this dangerous precedent, something that future governments that have a problem with the agenda of certain minority groups or have a problem with groups that just don't fit their political agenda, would this set a precedent that is very dangerous vis-a-vis all groups.
Senator Toulajan.
Senator, I would agree with you. It does set a dangerous precedent. I mean, I'm all for demonstration. Like I said, we need to have peaceful protest. We need to have give the Canadians the ability to let us know how they feel. Like Senator Batters mentioned yesterday, the Ukrainian community is very, very concerned. And I know that in Toronto, they were out there, expressing their concern. They were out there protesting. But yet in, the federal capital, the seat of the government, they cannot come. So I hear you, but it's always, as a human rights person, I support peaceful protest. Not anyone feeling threatened, not anyone feeling that they don't have the ability to perform their duties or go to work. Like we did see, I mean, there were instances where, and I know some young girls in scarf had to be accompanied. It was one of our own MPs, brought that issue up. So we were seeing that. So I think it's better to look at the reality of what was happening. And we wish it didn't happen. We wish it had been handled better. But we have a prime minister who was missing. We didn't hear anything from the government. And I fended calls from irate Liberals supporters who said, where's our prime minister? So, peaceful protest, I'm all for it.
Resuming debate, en débat, Sénatrice Odette.
Senator Odette. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Dear colleagues, first, I would like to thank the Wendat nations, the Inuit, the Wolastoqey, Atskamek, for welcoming me on their land here in Quebec. I'm rising for the first time before you, but this is not my inaugural speech. I will be offering it shortly in response to the speech from the throne. The stakes seem too high at this point, and they compel me to share my thoughts and observations as a person, but as a senator from Quebec. I would like to share my feelings and my observations that lead to more questions. As you know, I supported the statement of the Caucus of Black Parliamentarians in relation to the protests that took place in Ottawa on unceded Anishinaabe territory. I also joined the voices of Indigenous senators on these same events. I would also like to remind you that the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations of Saskatchewan, the Algonquin of Pikwatanagan, the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation Tribal Council, and the Anishinaabe Nation of Kitigan-Zibi have also expressed their concern over the violation of the First Nations protocols, the appropriation and misuse of traditional sacred objects and ceremonies. These are precious and sacred. I continue to support and stand behind these statements. I firmly uphold the right of everyone to demonstrate peacefully. Here's why. Peaceful demonstration is part of my own past. I participated through Past Activated, and I'd like to talk to some of them. Idle No More, the America Summit, the Wendake Amun March in Ottawa, and many times on the Parliament Hill, many times on the grounds of the Assemblée Nationale and in front of the Supreme Court in order to decry injustices faced by Indigenous women. On a few occasions, I've heard us refer to Indigenous protests, and we associate firearms to these. But I would like to reassure you, the only tool that I brought to these protests was my voice and my point of view. That being said, I cannot support hate, intolerance, the use of hate symbols or violence in any form. In the last few weeks, as many have said it, I hurt for Canada. Canada is trying to eliminate racism through its institutions, through many institutions. My question that has been raised many times in the past few weeks is that if the protesters were Black, Indigenous, or other cultural groups, how would they have been met? How would this protest have lasted like this? And my answer is simple. They would not have been tolerated, and this would not have lasted. The tolerance of protesters that are Indigenous or Black is lower, and we have proof of this. Police interventions and other measures like injunctions happened much faster when racialized Indigenous or vulnerable people are protesting. As mentioned in an article by Audrey Dipté, Associate Professor of History at Carleton University, in 2016, on the very first day of a peaceful protest in Toronto, Black Lives Movement participants were beaten and gassed by police. The same person, and I quote, says, in 2020 in Ottawa, a protest at a key intersection advocating for Black and Indigenous lives resulted in 12 people being charged and the protests being called off in 3 days. Now on to Émilie Nicolas from Le Devoir. He says, while racialized parents are being reported to Child Protection Services for nothing, dozens of children have been in Ottawa at the convoy for several weeks in questionable conditions. And I will add personally, no one lifted a finger. Émilie Nicolas continues to remind us of the homeless encampments that police have aggressively raised, citing the risk of fire, while there are countless Indigenous leaders who have been under tight police surveillance. The authorities are so unconcerned about the dangers posed by the far right that we were surprised by the occupation and sedition intentions that were clearly stated online of several of the convoy's organizers. End quote. I would also like to use today's platform. I could use today's platform to inflame the political discourse, but I won't do that. I will only express that certain parliamentarians unfortunately speak out of both sides of their mouths, a double standard in the face of blockades held by Indigenous people and those who stormed Parliament Hill. An ethnologist that I respect very much, Isabelle Picard, who is Wendat, also wrote in an article recently. She said, and I quote, 2 years ago to the day, all the news was focused on the Wet'suwet'en and what the media had called, at best, the railway crisis, at worst, the Indigenous crisis. Because this crisis was far from being entirely Indigenous, the people on the tracks were from all over. The people arrested were indeed Indigenous, unfortunately, almost all of them. At least in the traditional territory of the Wet'suwet'en, 28 people had been arrested by the RCMP after a coastal gas link injunction obtained by this company for a major gas pipeline that was run through the Wet'suwet'en territory. Since those pre-COVIDian events, negotiations have been mired in a status quo. On the board, about 50 more arrests. Almost all of them Indigenous people, women and elders in the mix. 10 days ago, a complaint was filed at the UN by opponents of the pipeline for violation of several articles on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Picard added that there are many differences between the events in Ottawa and those in British Columbia. One group burned thousands of liters of oil to make their point, while the others wanted to stop the oil from flowing onto their land. Some speak of freedom because they know it too well, and others can only hope for it because they no longer know it. Both sides, more if you count regional duplicates, however, are willing to stay put for as long as it takes to defend their beliefs." End quote. The evident herds and inquiries, including the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, clearly demonstrates the abuses of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit human rights committed and condoned by the Canadian state. These abuses continue to perpetuate an environment where trivialized violence is allowed to fester and perpetrators act with impunity. Our trust in the institutions is almost non-existent. But we continue to hope for this trust. I continue to hope for it. However, faced with such events, in light of the clemency of these same institutions, one can not be surprised or even offended by our reaction, our questioning, our amazement. So I find myself standing here bewildered. Why is there no mention of racism and the use of hateful symbols in the text of the proclamation of a public order emergency? Why are the tools and measures not applied in the same way to all? Certainly, it is important to make sure that everyone has the right to live safely and peacefully, and the people of Ottawa have their city back. But we can't ignore the threats that still exist in Ottawa and across the country. How can we ensure that the daily lives of the silent majority are no longer impeded in this way? But more importantly, how can we allow small groups to undermine and weaken our democracy? I have another concern. Using the Emergencies Act, can using the Emergency Measures Act justify restricting the right to legitimate protests? I hope not. So I urge my colleagues to ensure that a First Nations, Métis, or Inuit senator and a senator from the caucus of Black parliamentarians be part of the Parliamentary Review Committee, or any other measure that is to be deployed to review the government's action under the Act. This is important to me. We need to bring a different perspective and a diverse perspective to this. The same principles should apply as to who should conduct the inquiry and report to each House of the Parliament within 360 days of the end or revocation of the state of emergency. It's important here, again, to have a Métis, Inuit, or First Nations lens. As said Isabelle Picard, let's come back to love and peace. It does not seem to be our biggest problem, but to speak of love, we must also speak of hate and war. And to speak of freedom, we have to speak of servitude and slavery. And in my heart, I care for social justice and equality, and I dream of a society that is equal, where everyone has their space, where their cultures and their languages and histories are respected. I think debate is important. And I am here to listen, and I will take position soon. Thank you.
On debate, Senator Wallen.
Colleagues, the question we are being asked to consider is this. Did the events here in Ottawa over the last 3 weeks meet the threshold for this extraordinary imposition of the Emergencies Measures Act? And today, this question remains, why is it still in place? The emergency has been met, the blockade is gone, and surely the authorities will not be caught so flat-footed ever again. So the threat that protesters may come back in force seems unlikely. Intelligence operatives and police have surveillance and investigations underway to deal with crimes in the making, plots, or new actions. They had those powers before the invocation of the Emergencies Act. In a letter sent to parliamentarians from the Advocates for the Rule of Law, a nonpartisan think tank, they argued the following. The failure of the government and police to enforce existing laws and court orders is not a sound basis to expand state power with the declaration of a public order emergency when no such emergency has been proven to exist. One rule of law failure should not beget another. The letter goes on to state, it risks a gradual erosion of Parliament's role in favour of executive power, and it amounts to a damning admission of failure of state capacity. If Canada is to remain a functional and free democracy, then it must be able to solve problems using existing laws and established institutions and without resorting to the most extreme measures except when absolutely necessary. So I think we can all agree on both the importance of the rule of law in Canada and the objectivity of the courts, which together form the foundation of a just society. The Emergency Act asks Canadians to forfeit this most basic tenet of our democracy. In fact, what we actually witnessed was a colossal failure of leadership at all levels. I think it's fair to say that the convoy protest became an encampment due to the failure of planning and the inability to react. There was not a single barricade. Protesters were actually directed to Wellington Street, the main access to Parliament. There were existing laws to move trucks or do something about horns or diesel fumes or clogged streets, but those laws were not employed. And so it's difficult to accept now that bad decisions and inaction justifies using an act reserved for the most dire national security crisis. This act is meant to be used, well, never. And here is why. Its application is a judgment call, and judgments are political by definition when the government of the day substitutes itself for Parliament or the objectivity of the courts. The act comes first, then permission is sought. Invoking the Emergencies Act in this context has made the law a subject of partisan contention. And when the Prime Minister made this, for all intents and purposes, a vote of confidence in his government, well, it only further illustrates the problem. This is at the core of why emergency legislation is so risky and so dangerous. The ability in a free and democratic society to protest requires the blind application of the law. The Prime Minister deems some protests in Canada to be acts of democracy. He even participates in some. No action was taken against church burnings or topplers of statues. That was called understandable. But the Prime Minister declared the trucker protests here in Ottawa, the protesters, to be racist, white supremacists, misogynists, people he didn't like and would never talk to. But does being frustrated, angry, or critical of government actually make you an enemy? And so the issue is who should decide what is lawful advocacy and what is an illegal protest or occupation? Who is to decide to whom laws apply or whose actions can trigger the invocation of the Emergency Act? That is why we have the rule of law and the obligation to make your case for extra powers to a court and not leave it to the judgment call of the government of the day. So why the Emergencies Act now? We did not see it invoked at the G10 or OCA or when Parliament was attacked in 2014. We did not even see it at 9/11. I lived in New York then and witnessed the fear and genuine crisis that unfolded. And even during those extraordinary times, there were fierce debates over what was called a ticking time bomb situation. How far can and should you go to fight terrorism? The argument was, for example, can you waterboard someone to get information to defuse the ticking bomb? History teaches us that too often actions taken in the heat of the moment, even in the face of actual terrorism, proved to be ill-considered and were rejected once they became known. But that was months, even years after the fact. One issue today that I find particularly troubling here is the foreign involvement and financing being used as a justification. Foreign money has been flowing into this country for years to support or oppose a variety of political causes and issues. Stop a pipeline, save a whale, or support a truck convoy. So why is it okay for some causes to be funded by foreign supporters but not others? The finance minister stated that new FinTrack rules expanded under the new Act will allow for greater financial reporting obligations of crowdfunding sites and cryptocurrency platforms and will be made permanent with legislation. I agree FinTrack as it stands lacks the necessary teeth needed to track the finances of criminals or extremist groups. But to use this as an opportunity to test out new laws is deeply unparliamentary and takes advantage of this situation to advance policy, perhaps even political goals. If you want FinTrack 3.0, then present it, defend it, and vote on it. Again, we see the extraordinary powers before a parliamentary vote. If you disagree with the government, can you be excluded from economic activity in this country? Can your finances be frozen or essentially sealed? The remedies for those who have been unfairly targeted require resources because banks and financial institutions have been given immunity from liability under this new act. So appealing to your bank or the police or the courts is probably not going to resolve the matter. And it is costly. And if your resources are frozen, then it's not even an option. So many are caught in this catch-22. Of course, no one wants our way of life, our democratic rights and freedoms, or our system of government put at risk. So what other options are there other than the imposition of a draconian law? We saw in Coutts and Emerson and at Windsor's Ambassador Bridge, talking and, more importantly, listening brought blockades and protests to an end. Criminals were charged and arrested. The weapons cache was seized under existing laws. But that did not happen here in Ottawa. Why? Well, as Emergency Preparedness Minister Bill Blair said, we cannot leave anyone with the impression that our democracy is negotiable or subject to efforts of appeasement. The discussions in Coutts and Emerson and Windsor did not erode trust in public institutions or put our democracy at risk. Talking helped, listening helped, and it could have been an opportunity to turn the temperature way down, calm the fears, and bridge the differences here in Ottawa, too. Colleagues, I come from a part of the country where it's normal to wear camo, drive a semi for a living, bring your kids to events because you don't have a nanny, or be skeptical of almost any government intervention in your daily life, mandates included. Many truckers have been working all through the pandemic, delivering things we needed or simply wanted. They had no place to eat and were left to use the side of the road. These were folks at the heart of the convoy, not the opportunistic agitators that rose to prominence, commandeered the headlines, and in the process became the justification for this bill. Ultimately, this debate is a litmus test. The result will reflect your own experience, your own beliefs, your own worldview. Sitting with colleagues in a restaurant the other night when the House vote was announced, wild cheers broke out. It felt more like a victory whoop at a sporting event than the realization that our country had just made a profound and very risky decision. Democracy is messy. Free speech is about tolerating speech you disagree with so that you, in turn, are free to say what you believe. Every day we tolerate risks and inconvenience and discomfort to participate in and protect our democracy. It's part of the price of upholding our rights and liberties. Emergency powers cannot and must not be normalized, especially at a time when more and more Canadians are losing faith in our institutions. The defenders of this bill say trust the government. They will not go too far. Just trust them. Well, just watch me gave me no comfort, and just trust me gives me less still. The political fallout from the War Measures Act haunts us still. It has shaped and distorted politics for half a century. It had consequences nobody could have predicted. I fear the same may happen, that today those who are rounded up may go silent, but not away, that those who have been targeted, disparaged, or had their livelihoods threatened will disengage from our civic life. I fear that others will decide that separatism is the only answer. We have seen the precedents. When people lose faith and trust in our national institution, the ties that bind fray. Canada itself is an act of faith. Our east-west configuration is daily challenged by the north-south pull of common geography, shared interests, and trade. If we ignore the reality of political difference, if we pretend smugly that somehow partisan division is an American phenomenon and foreign players are to blame, that is to deny the very basis of our democracy. Opposing the government of the day is democracy. It's how it works. It's why we have elections. It's why we have debates and votes here and in the other place. It's the very basis of our parliamentary democracy. To silence criticism or dissent through extraordinary laws is the very action we would decry and denounce everywhere else in the world. And that is why I will vote against this act. Thank you, colleagues.
Resuming debate, Senator Busson. Senator Busson.
Honourable Senators, chers sénateurs,
Senator Busson,
I rise today.
We have only 5 minutes left until the noon break.
Okay.
Okay. So then we'll pause and you can resume.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Honourable Senators, chers sénateurs, I rise today to speak in favour of the Emergencies Act. Our capital and the entire country by association had been taken hostage and continues to be at risk. Early last week, it had unfortunately become clear that the usual police procedures of the municipal police force had been overwhelmed, as their chief had put it. The blame game is for another day, but we now must step up to the plate. Last Friday, the full force of the state, enabled by the Emergencies Act, began the process to end this occupation of our capital, and we are now debating essentially whether we should sanction it. We, as the Chamber of Sober Second Thought, are called upon to act, not for our own political beliefs or philosophies, but for the greater good. Like the pandemic itself, this is one of those times when we must act decisively, not in a partisan way, in order to support our democracy and those who put themselves in harm's way to defend it for us. This is not over, as some of us have suggested. I implore you to consider the message we would send if at this moment in history, we take advantage of the freedom that was won back for us this weekend, and yet vote no for this matter, disagreeing with the act coming into force in the first place. Again, this is not over. Those who coach the occupation of our nation's capital and the attendant roadblocks across Canada will be emboldened if we, dear colleagues, do not support our national institutions, its police officers, and the rule of law. I will repeat again, this is not over. I'm so proud of the police officers from across the country. In the past days, they employed textbook professional policing techniques, using their powers in a measured way, no tear gas, no rioting, no looting, and no loss of life. The Emergencies Act continues to enable the police to react with strength and to ensure our democracy is reestablished. If we vote no, the wrong message will be sent. Contrary to suggestions made today that we can just invoke it again if we get this wrong are untenable. We never want to invoke this again. Truckers and their supporters gathered in Ottawa on or about January 29th to rally against mask mandates, lockdowns, restrictions on gatherings, and other COVID-19 preventative measures. These peaceful protesters, comprised of Canadian citizens exercising the right to demonstrate, soon found their cause co-opted by a much darker element in our society. Call them what you will, but know that they stand for the overthrow of our government and the dissolution of our democracy. Canada prides itself on embracing and supporting human rights enshrined in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Our charter describes our rights and what we can expect and demand in our civil society, but also suggests that with this, a corresponding contract exists to respect the rights of others as well. Freedom is a two-way street, balanced to ensure that the rights of one do not infringe on the rights of another. We depend on this balance to live our life together with respect. One of these rights is the right to speak against the government and to oppose any law we disagree with. However, and disturbingly, there has been a wave of ultra-right groups who have taken the trucker-inspired protest against mask mandates and morphed it into a movement that is not only disruptive to the rights of the citizens of Ottawa, but also has brazenly ignored the rule of law and created an environment and hatred for those who live and work in our nation's capital. Spin-off protests have occurred and are still occurring around the country, as well as at border crossings and airports. Hardcore members of these groups thwarted requests and negotiations to have them leave, and they locked down, thumbing their noses not just at the police, but at the rights of each and every one of us to be safe and secure. Those in Ottawa were the hardest hit, but the entire country has felt the sting of this lawlessness and disrespect as we watch the nation's capital be turned into an amusement park for anarchists. Make no mistake, their mission remains dismantling of our government and replacing it with one of their own. Sorry, Senators, we're not going to be running the country with the Governor General anytime soon. These people, by definition, are anarchists. They are professionally led, well-funded, and skillfully planning the downfall of our democracy. They use children as human shields to obstruct enforcement.
Senator Busson, I'm sorry, it is noon. I have to interrupt you. We will resume debate at 1.
Thank you. I'll look forward to continuing.